Okay, thank you for having me. I welcome any questions. When I picked the Korowai tribe to minister among, I made a vow to God that I wanted to reach the Korowai people or die trying, and God almost fulfilled both parts of that request. So be careful what you promise God, right? I did not grow up in a church-going home. I grew up in a rural town in Missouri. Spent my summers canoeing, out in the woods, hiking, and God allowed me to do that for the sake of Jesus later in my life. So I feel very blessed. About 18, I doubted that there was a God. I had a lot of distrust about churches. But I begin to see nature. It seems to cry out that there is a creator. And I begin to see the nature of man as well. We have drives, we have needs. We have hunger, there's such a thing as food. We have thirst, there's such a thing as water. We get tired, there's sleep. We have sex drives, and there's such a thing as a legitimate expression of that. But every tribe of mankind is religious. There's no tribes of atheists. The only atheism is pushed by the government, and that's because they want to be your God. And so I begin to see that just as hunger and thirst and all the other drives, there's a religious instinct in mankind. So who put it there? So I begin to read the Bible, and there's nobody that spoke or nobody that acted like Jesus, and so I fell in love with Jesus. I read the Gospels. I was greatly moved. Instead of being argued into the faith, I was attracted to this wonderful person. And I believe I got the missionary call as soon as I was saved. I saw that many people could not go overseas. They were not physically healthy enough. They didn't have the endurance or even the desire. And so as soon as I was saved, I wanted to go. And because of my upbringing, I wanted to go to the most needy place I could find. So my wife and I are both nurses. We've been married 22 years. We have 4 kids. One of them's here. And we begin to prepare to go to the most needy place we could find. So we went in 2004, got my first case of malaria, came back, raised support, got preparation, went back out again long-term in 2006. I picked the tribe after 6 months of survey or so. Hiking week after week through the jungle, we picked the Korowai tribe and we began to build our house there. West Papua is the easternmost province of Indonesia. Indonesia is the most populous Muslim nation in the world. I don't even know how many, 250, maybe 300 million people. But out in the east, most Indonesians they have straight hair. They kind of look like Filipino people or brown skin. But out in Papua, you have black Melanesian indigenous people, tribal people. And the health care, most of Indonesia is Muslim, but this remote area, Indonesia is just not taken care of. And these people are so remote that they're hard to get to. And so I began to survey, picked the Korowai tribe. To circumnavigate my area, it takes 2 weeks to hike around. And the hiking is not like here. You're up to your ankles, you're up to your knees in mud. Sometimes you need to start right at dawn so that you can reach another village right at dark because you don't want to overnight in the forest. Even some of the locals get skittish about that. But if we placed ourselves right in the middle, I could reach every post within 12 hours. And so we went there, we partnered with a team of Papuan Christians from the highlands that their churches sent out. So it was a Western family and about 24 Papuan evangelists. And so I placed myself in the center, and we put the other evangelists in the surrounding villages, some of them 6, 8, 10, 12 hours away. We tied our posts together with shortwave radios so that they could call about any needs, about any sick people, any people wounded in tribal fighting. And then I could put on my backpack with medicine and hike out to treat them, or carry a satellite phone and a GPS and hike out to call in the coordinates, hack out an area big enough so that the heli could come down and medically evacuate the sick or the wounded. So we built her house. The last tribal killing in my village was in 2007 as my house was being finished. They accused a man of witchcraft. They tied his arms and his legs, broke his arms and legs, took him down to the creek, me and Noah's swimming hole, and drowned him in the river. So that's the kind of people the Korowai were. They are animistic, meaning they live in fear of the spirits. National Geographic called them the treehouse people because they lived in tree houses 20 or 30 foot above the floor of the jungle. Anybody can think why? Animals? Floods? Other people. They're afraid of witches. They live in tree houses because they're afraid of witches. And when they build a tree house, they put anti-witch repellent at the bottom and charms at the top to keep the witches away. So that shows you the degree in which animistic fear controls their life. So about every 40 minutes or so, you have two brothers with a tree house and their one wife or multiple wives, and they live there in the treehouse cluster. You can walk 40 minutes to an hour, hour and a half to another cluster of tree houses. In this region, probably maybe as big as Sacramento, you have about 4,000 souls spread out, hard to reach. So we knew that we had to live among them day by day, maybe for years, to see any sort of change. And so we moved there. We set about hiking about every day for me, treehouse to village. How do you evangelize an illiterate people or a people that have limited Indonesian? Because Papua has about 700 languages, but the basic trade language is Indonesian. And God often turns tragedies into triumphs. Obed was a tribal guy. He was shot with arrows and left for dead. The evangelist nursed him back to health. He learned Indonesian. He was our first translator. And then we would use picture books, and we would explain the gospel over and over again at every treehouse. Very repetitive, but the work of the ministry is repetitive, is it not? And walked ourselves to death practically. The other evangelists were doing the same. In the afternoons at 4 p.m., my wife would beat on a cooking pot, clang, 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 and people would hear that, and the sick would come to be treated on our front porch. If they were too sick, they'd tell us about it, and I'd hike out with my backpack. At the end of our first term, we had one convert who promptly died. Condreas. He helped go with me, translate for me. We often shared huts together. He liked to carry my backpack for me. He got a high fever. He knew he was going to die. The tribe began to work their animistic magic on him. The two evangelists that lived with us, Jimmy and Perrin, they tried to pray for him. They were kicked out of the hut. Perrin, she was pulled out of the hut by her hair. But in the middle of the night, Condreas crawled out of the hut and onto the floor of the jungle there. And he gathered his friends around him and he said, "Listen, I'm going to die. I know it, but I believe in Jesus. I'm going to heaven. You must come too. You must believe in Jesus." And now the core leadership of our churches, the young men that are leading the church were Condreas' friends. So God works. He turns tragedy into triumph, right? The only one young man that did not believe was Mesak. And he followed us for a time. He composed hymns in Korowai to be sung at church. Beautiful singer, beautiful song composer. But he had participated in a tribal murder in exchange for a young girl. He would kill this supposed witch, and then when the young girl would get old enough, she would become his wife. And despite being sick and dying, he held on to that. The village this young girl was from, the girls were sick. They could not come into Danawage because the men would hassle them every time. They would come for treatment, and the men would harass them, intimidate them, so they would go back to their village, and sometimes they wouldn't finish their malarial treatment. And Mesak cornered her at the bathing hole, tried to force himself upon her even though he was sick, and she ran to our home. A week later, Mesak was dead. But all the other young men, they are now Christians, and they believe. So those were the first fruits of the gospel there. I'd have to say from Condreas' ministry. So that was our first term. My wife got a tropical fever, was paralyzed for a couple weeks. Her lower body would not work. I had to carry her around. We got pregnant, and she had a miscarriage because of that. We had to come home a couple weeks early on furlough. Because of the health problems, we had to go to Singapore because she began to hemorrhage. And the very night we arrived in Singapore, she began to bleed out. She almost bled to death in the back of a taxi cab on the way to the hospital. So we lost the, so we had the miscarriage, and then we came home. And so that was our victorious first term on the field. So after 4 or 5 years, that is the result. The sad fact is that most missionaries go out and come home at about 5 years before they ever see any results. The work is only getting started. And you read the missionary biographies, and sometimes it's 7 or 14 years before a single convert is made. And I often wondered, do we have the gumption to stick around to see the results? The second term was much of the same, constant traveling, constant hiking. The work got too much for us. We recruited other folks. Mission orgs talk about missionary attrition. And what they mean is the Western families that go out to the mission field and then they come back because they're depressed or have marriage problems or the health breaks. And again, that's about at 5 years. But among our area, we have a different kind of missionary attrition. We have 24 Papuan evangelists working with us, sometimes 36 when we begin to build the airstrip. And out of the 30 or 35 men and their families that helped us, 8 of them or their wives or their children have died. And they've been buried, some of them are buried in our village. So that's true missionary attrition, people being sent out and dying at their post. One of them was Wiandi, a 60-year-old pastor. He was in a village 12 hours from us. A great number of his village people were sick. He hiked the 12 hours to tell me, and his heart failed, and he was dead a week later. But we were able to get to the village and treat the sick there, and they all recovered. And so right now I'm writing a book, and the chief motivation for that is that these Papuan Christians would not be forgotten. Because if the Western missionary dies, it might make the news, right? But if a poor Papuan dies, hiking 12 hours to help people that he had gone to serve with only a net bag, a machete, and his Bible, barefoot, he'll be forgotten, and I don't want that to happen. We had some converts and some professions that second term, and I didn't know, do they love Jesus or do they love my medicine? Because that's not always clear, right? Especially among tribal communities. But we begin to see, in the past, people would get sick and die in their tree houses. Nobody would help them. Nobody would help them, and the body and the treehouse would rot together. But I began to see a change. The young men would go out. If you're half starved already, if you're malnourished, to take a lot of your best food and to carry it out to a sick person, that means a lot. If you're hungry, you don't want to share your food. And they would go out, and I'd say, "What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm going out to give food and to pray for the sick person." And then astoundingly, they were in a different clan, and they joke, "They used to be our enemies. We used to fight. They killed my uncle." But he's going out now to take them food and to pray for them. And so we begin to see there are changes. this culture is changing. The children didn't seem to play much. They'd look at you outside their hut, and they seemed to be too scared to play. But by the second term, we'd have 180, 100, 120 people out in our front yard. And the men, the grown-ups, they used to come to our yard carrying their bows and arrows because there was such distrust. And then they began to come and leave their bows and arrows in their huts. And the kids would start playing, and the people are afraid of witches, but after a while they began to play witch tag. That was their favorite game. So this object of fear became an object of mockery. So that's a victory. And so we begin to see changes. We begin to see that some of the young men, they would ask us, how do you read? I want to read the Bible for myself. And so we really saw that, I think it's awful hard to walk from the church and back, which the church is a hut with a thatch roof. Pigs run through service at times. You preach and you're barefoot, and we've had tribal fights in there before. You're trying to pray, and a guy sticks his bow and arrow through the window, yelling to his enemy. And the church announcements are like, wait to fight till after the church. Or the church announcement is, don't poop in the same spot as you get your drinking water from the creek. You got to poop downriver. Like, is this really our church announcements? But so tribal life is surreal. Some people would come with their, they would still wear leaves. They would cover their privates with leaves. We'd have topless women in our church wearing grass skirts. I would show them things like flashlights, and they would startle. And the sign for being startled, they'd suck in and beat their chest. Oh, what's that? And putting on suntan lotion. I hear them talk. Oh, that's what makes the skin white. Like, yeah, not exactly. And at first, I'd come upon a group of women bailing a stream. They plug up the stream. They take parts of the sago palm tree as shovels, and they'd bail out the water until the bottom was muddy and wiggling with minnows, and then they'd scoop that up for their food. And so I'd come along, and they see me, and they all throw everything up in the air and run off, and they yell, Tario Aling, white demon. But then a year later, they started calling me Tario Aling Yani Yanop, and Yanop is person. So I graduated to personhood. And then they began to receive me. We'd have visitors to check out our house, the solar panels. After a while, we got solar panels. That was a big day. After a couple more years, we got refrigeration. At first, we lived with candlelight. Candlelight dinners are not always romantic, especially in the jungle. All the gnats and the flies circle in a cloud. And then my wife did our wash in the river, probably for the first 4 or 5 years. And but yeah, life is hard there, but it was also really good. We lived right by a creek. Every day we'd swim at least 3 or 4 times. My son fished all the crawdads out of our creek, him and his little friend Yoli. At first there were lots of crawdads, but because we had no refrigeration, I was always meat hungry. I was always hungry for protein. And at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, I'd be like, oh, I got it. Well, the crawdads have red eyes, so we'd go out and spear enough of them to get about 1 kilogram of meat. And I'd invite the tribal guys, I'm sure you're hungry as well, come hunt with me. But they'd be scared. Oh, there's witches out there at night. So if your fear of witches is greater than the gnawing of your gut for hunger, that's a pretty substantial fear. We baptized our first converts. The first young man I baptized just graduated Bible school 2 weeks ago. And he's going back to the village. And that's always been our goal. Our goal is to see Korowai shepherds leading Korowai sheep. I'm good. I just need to stretch. The driving hurts me still. So we wanted to see Korowai shepherds leading Korowai sheep. And sometimes people are like, oh, what kind of church do you pastor? You want to pastor a church there. And that's never been the goal. The goal is to prepare the locals to carry on the work and to not need me, because you could get sick or die at any time or your visa pulled. Are there any questions up to this point? You have any questions? Just bring,
Has the government
Yes, I'll get to that more. So Papua is very neglected. There's money sent to develop the region, but it goes missing before it ever reaches. So it's a very corrupt country. And so our third term, our second term we ended, we had some fruit, came home, my wife kind of suffered an autoimmune collapse, came home for furlough to rest, I spoke 100 times in 35 states that first year, averaged about 3 speaking engagements in a week, and then we went back. And the third term we established a school. Seeing that we needed to put it into indigenous hands or Indonesian hands, we partnered with a rich reformed group in Jakarta, and they sent teachers out, and they began to take care of the school under their foundation. And they sent nurses as well. There's the Siloam hospital branches, and it's Christian. They have the best trained nurses in the country, and they took over the medical clinic for us. So in 17 years, we saw a church established. We saw a school opened. We saw a medical clinic open. We turned over the school and the medical clinic to capable Indonesian hands. We built a dormitory and an orphanage. And then other interferences began. They opened an illegal gold mine upriver from us. The trees were clear cut. The game, the pigs and the cassowary all fled. The water was dirty. The local clan up there began to starve. I saw pictures of the people look like skeletons. The gold miners imported rice, but the rice prices were 20 times the normal price. So the local people were basically pushed to the side. And then I found they were dumping mercury in the water. So I began to wage a campaign, got the mine closed twice, and then they put in rules that the locals must be fairly compensated, and mercury use is prohibited. So that was a partial victory, but it earned me enemies. I have hate websites devoted to me now in Indonesia. I am a spy sent by the CIA to spread division in their beloved country. So if you can't be famous, you can be notorious, right? And we begin to get death threats. We begin to get intimidated by the army. Had to brief the kids. This is the bend in the river where you hide if they come down by helicopter and snatch your dad. A Papuan pastor in the government office overheard the soldiers looking at my information online and making a plan to snatch me and deport me. But we got the gold bosses put in jail. We got 2 helicopters detained, and a lot of fines, and then we got the rules changed. The school was running. There was an epidemic of all things of champak, measles, to our south. Over 100 people died among the Asmat tribe, who had more access to medicine and more food. So the health department gave us vaccinations, loaned us a doctor and government nurses, and we vaccinated every village within our region. About 16 or 18 that we counted as villages at that time. But every case of malaria began to get worse. And if you work yourself to death, it comes out more. So case number 20, 21, 22, 23, every time my spleen swelled until I could hardly sit. I couldn't tie my shoes because there was such a big bulge where my spleen was. And by the end of the vaccinations, I just couldn't go. I was puking constantly. The government nurses agreed to vaccinate the last 2 villages, and we began to arrange a medevac. And I could hardly walk to the airplane. The last Sunday before I was medically evacuated, 24 baptized believers, celebrated the Lord's Supper in my village alone. And there are many baptized believers in the other villages as well, including a lot of false professors as well, but that's true here as well. So you must examine yourself, not just go to church, but you must be born again. And so another victorious exit from the village. puking on the trail and practically crawling to the airplane in parts. And each kid packed these little mission planes are limited, so each kid was able to pack their backpack, and that was all. Everything else was left in the village. And I said, we'll be back, I'll be well, we'll be back in 3 months. And that was 3 years ago. Are there any questions up to this point?
You said that Indonesia is primarily Muslim.
Yes.
Do they proselyte into the villages, or is that just...
Yes, they are trying. There are programs of trying to Islamicize Papua. And if you pose as a tourist, I've taken guests and posed as a tourist in their mosques, and they'll have signs on the wall. If you are a faithful Muslim family with 4 or more kids, we will pay your fare out to Papua. And we had a Muslim come and offer a bag of rice every month to some of our young men. And Salomo, one of our believers, said, if I live or die, I'm the Lord's. I'll believe in Jesus even if I starve. We had a group of men try to intimidate our teachers and try to take some of the kids to put them in these Islamic boarding schools where they rock and they recite the Quran all day in Arabic. They don't speak Arabic, but they just memorize, it's rote memorization of the syllables. And 8-10 hours a day, they'll sit there and rock like they're crazy, and they're put under strict supervision. So these men came and tried to pressure our teachers to hand over the kids, and I thought we were going to fight them. And finally they backed off and and so it's a race against time. If we don't establish Christian schools, private schools, the Muslims are going to do the work. And there's cases where they will pay the tribal people a small fee to say the Shahada, there is no God but God and Muhammad is the prophet. In one case, they bought a prostitute for a couple men to get them to convert. So with those methods of evangelism, you can tell the content of the religion, right? All those things forbidden to man on earth, you get in heaven, right? Your wide-eyed houris and your wine in abundance if you go to Islamic heaven. So yes, there is an Islamic effort to make Papua Muslim. Yeah?
2 questions. One, how much do you bench right now?
You got to pay for every question, Rich.
Okay, sorry.
So
2,
the answer is not enough. It's never enough.
I've seen a lot of, pictures of Sniffy, and those
Sniff,
guys
yeah.
from the beginning.
Uh-huh.
And even that, remember the child with the
Yeah.
infection?
That was...
How common was that? I mean, I know the kid probably was...
It's, yeah, so Sniffy, the tribal guy, he calls him Sniffy because his nose was rotting off. So that tells you about his sense of humor, right? So Sniffy's dead. His basically the bacteria ate his face. And then the little kid with the hole in his cheek, that would be Noma, severe malnourishment paired with bacteria. It just ate a hole in his cheek. So we were able to get him fixed. And that...
You did that a lot, right? A lot of...
There was, when we were there, about 90% of the people had skin disease. And Indonesia declared victory in the war against leprosy. And I was like, what? And then so I sent them pictures of lepers down south, and the Dinas Kesehatan, the health department in our region labeled that as worms. So I had to send the photos to the provincial level and say, this is textbook leprosy, this is not worms. So they were fudging their numbers because they didn't want the shame of having lepers still in the region. If they had just done their job and not pocketed the money, they could have cured these. So finally they sent a team to treat these lepers, and I think, so they had lost several toes and fingers by that time, and part of the ear had fallen off or rotted.
I remember we talking just a vial of penicillin would...
Yeah. You'll have impetigo and yaws. What is yaws? Frambusia is what they call it. But there will be people suffering for 6 or 8 months or a year, and they'll have these weeping sores that will spread, and parts of their body look like it's rotting, weeping. Penicillin is cheap. You give them 1 shot and a follow-up shot 2 or 3 days later, and it's like a miracle. Totally clear. Totally dry, Within a couple weeks, no sighing at all. So what a shame that so many people are suffering so many preventable diseases, and something that would be 50 cents or $1 could cure them when they had been suffering for months. If you could cure somebody that had been suffering almost a year with $1, wouldn't you do it? So at first we'd have the kids with the big bellies, we'd have the skin disease. Now we have a whole new crop of fat, chubby babies. And it's nice to see. Sometimes the pictures bring me to tears. These mothers that used to be skinny and marked with skin disease, now they're holding these fat, happy babies. And, that's not salvation. We're there to plant churches, but it's the whole package. And people will say, oh, you do medical care in order to gain a hearing for the gospel. I'm like, you do medical care because they're sick. They're made in the image of God. Who wants to see that? Even if they never profess faith, you want them to be healthy in this life. So it's an act of love. How can you pass their hut without wanting to help them? So we've planted trees, we've sent chickens to every village, taught them how to plant peanuts and corn, and we have seen a increase in their health over the years. At first it was quite shocking, but now the videos you see are mostly new videos. But there are still forgotten pockets, and it's hard to get the government there, so we pay our own nurses to send them to those forgotten areas. Another question?
I'm curious, of all the places in the world, what made you choose this region in particular?
I think it was because my wife and I are nurses. I was former military. I grew up kind of a hillbilly in the woods, and this is a niche where I could be useful. So we should assess our gifts, we should assess our personalities and see where we fit. So maybe I didn't belong in polite society, but I can't sing worth a hoot. I hate wearing ties, but God gave me strong legs to hike. So God can use you, whatever, if your personality, yeah. What other questions do you have? Mm-hmm.
Two questions, brother. So, having that they're superstitious, when you originally went there, being white, did you come across any type of danger as being a witch? And then the second question is, you mentioned about clusters of the different tree houses. So, can you kind of give us some insight in regards to how is there churches at the different clusters?
Okay, good. Yeah, good question. Yeah. I was so different than them, I fell out of their normal expectations. I didn't fit the rules, so they were able to accept me easier. And, I believe in indigenous evangelists, but sometimes if the clans are always in constant warfare, it takes an outsider to kind of break, they don't know how to categorize you. You're not sided with one clan or another, so you're there and you kind of can break their expectations and they accept you. You're just, So, my wife is a tall white woman, so they don't abuse her as much as, they don't mistreat her as much as they would one of their own tribal women. So we're able to step outside of their expectations and not live by the rules, because the rules stink, because many societies are dysfunctional. You watch the National Geographic and it's, this tribe is proud warriors living in harmony with nature. That's baloney. They are scratching out a living. They are fighting tooth and nail against nature, and they're losing. I took a group photo of the young men, the teenagers, about 14 years ago. Every single person in that photo is dead, except for one we sent out to the coast for education. And I'm 46. There's not a lot. Some churches are like, what are you doing wrong? Why did you get malaria 24 times? It's because I live there. Most people are dead by my age. And did you do something? I'm like, it's the cost of, it's just the price of doing business there. You're going to die early. And there's really no way around it. We use mosquito nets, we use DEET. I would use like 3 mosquito nets, one under me, one over me, and one as a blanket. I would wrap myself up in a mosquito net burrito, and I still got malaria 24 times. And then the other one, how do you form a church when there's all these scattered tree houses? Well, every time the government or the churches go into one of these villages, into one of these regions, they find it necessary to begin to gather the people into villages. So the Korowai have their tree houses, but then they usually build a hut in the village as well. Some are resistant because they don't like being near dead people because they're spirits. In fact, my house was built on haunted land. Somebody had died, so they gave me the land. But it's necessary to gather the people so that you can teach them, so that you can preach to them. And every time a village is formed, the rate of homicide and fighting increases temporarily because people are not used to living close together. So the village forms, and sometimes they're fighting every day, and they're lobbing arrows back and forth for a while. But that mostly ended about 2011, 2012, and the quarrels got more low-key after that. So, any other questions? Mm-hmm.
Have you seen the culture of the Korowai tribe change since when you first landed and as till now?
Yes, the culture of play between clans, the culture of giving, of caring for each other. We have now 13, 14, 15 Korowai girls going to school. And at first, they were resisted. The men would turn them back. They would intimidate the girls. For a while, we would have to walk up and walk the girls down to school or go threaten the men to let the girls go to school. And so now they're living in my house. You know, all my daughter's clothes that we had to leave behind. I see pictures of these cute little Korowai kids wearing my daughter's dresses, and I'm like, yeah, I had to leave everything behind. That makes me sad, but look, you know, these girls get to profit, get to prosper from my children's toys, from their clothes. So yeah, there's been lots of changes. It's the physical and also just how they relate. They don't grab their bows and arrows the first thing anymore. So that's an achievement. And you know, one of the tribal guys said, the gospel brings peace here between fellow man. So the gospel brings us peace with God, but it also brings us peace with other people. Sometimes that's hard in this world. What other questions? I saw. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, is there any translation work happening?
Yes. Yes. At first, we would record the Korowai believers explaining the gospel and play that to the tree houses so that the older people could understand. We'd use translators, and we'd hike with them and explain the gospel to the old people. I recruited another Western family, and he sort of focused on the linguistics. And the first guy I baptized, who just graduated, the two of them together translated the catechism. And the catechism is great for illiterate tribal people. We're walking on the trail for 8 hours. You know, who made you, God? Why did God make you for his glory? So they're able to walk and be catechized at the same time. So sometimes we think the evangelism stuff happens inside the church on a given day in a special format. But if you're spending all your days on the trail, you can speak to each other while you're walking as well. We see that in the New Testament. And those guys in the Bible were hardy men, walk all night sometimes talking. What other questions do you have? Mm-hmm.
Trevor, so you've been out of Papua for 3 years now.
Yes.
What's the nature of your work now that you're out, not on the ground?
Yeah. I didn't die. That's an achievement. So I often spent all day, 18 hours, 20 hours a day in bed. Got greatly depressed, writhed in pain, but then I'd get Facebook messages. Little boys that grew up wearing leaves in these tree houses. Oh, Bapa, I'm graduating high school this year. Next year I want to go to Bible school. Please pray for me. And that's a great encouragement. And then something happened when I got sick is some of the teachers and evangelists I work with, they took the ball and ran. So once, you know, when you're hiking along the trail, you're kind of at the ant level view, right? You know, you can't email anybody, you can't really talk because you're just 1 foot in front of the other. I got 6 more hours of hiking through a swamp. I need to get there before dark or it's going to be a really bad night. So that doesn't free you up for the big strategic picture. And then you get sick and you're removed and you can talk to other people and say, oh, over the next 3 years, this needs to happen, this needs to happen. We need this school building. These young believers, we're going to put through linguistic training so they themselves can translate the Bible. So you're able to see kind of the bird's eye view, the strategic level. And since I've been sick, the ministry has expanded. Not only the church planted, the school planted, the medical clinic, the dormitory/orphanage in Danawage. We opened a school in a different village, Fuao, in the Mambramo region. We just opened 2 preschools. We sent 2 nurses to remote places that kids were dying of malaria. And now, instead of the 60 kids in Danawage, we help a total of 250 kids plus the 15 in higher education. 7 have graduated, 1 died, but 6 have returned to their villages. 1 is opening a new work among the Mamararum tribe that has never had a missionary. And another one just opened a preschool and is running the church. So we have graduates through the scholarship program. They train, and then they, upon agreement, they come back to serve their community so that there's not this brain drain where people get educated and then they stay in the city, so the tribe doesn't get any smarter. So that's what's happened. In the meantime, I've been trying to recover. This ministry has expanded, mostly through managers and Indonesian teachers. I didn't die, that's a plus. I'm 2 chapters away from finishing my doctoral dissertation. But when you get sick and you see double, a doctoral dissertation has a lot of nitpicky little things. Is this a semicolon? What's the difference between a semicolon and a colon? Is this a comma? Is this a period? I can't handle this now. Give it another month. Trying to read, you see double, you're in extreme pain. So I want to finish this doctoral dissertation this year. I'm writing a book. I just signed the contract last month. And and then I'm trying to fund these schools and travel. What other questions do you have? Mm-hmm.
Very interested in the book. Any idea when that would be?
Yeah, some weeks I feel better than others. I'm hoping to have a draft together by January. And right now it's 8.
Where will we be able to find it?
I don't know. I don't know yet. So I just got to get through it first. So man has many plans, but you need that strength to carry through, right? So,
How is your wife?
My wife is emotionally exhausted. So, there's a temptation. You go to church, you put on the fake smile, everything's okay. The missionaries, you send all reports of success, right? Some churches want the numbers, how many were saved, how many were baptized, and I've tried to stay away from that. I've tried to be brutally honest about everything, and my family has suffered a lot of adjustment. I had severe pain last year. I went through depression. My wife is a bit exhausted. The kids have had some adjustment issues. Noah, he loved the village. He tried to go to a school in Malaysia, and the kids were just a lot different. They didn't like to go fight behind the building in between classes. So what kind of kids are these? Don't like to wrestle and fight. That's strange, huh? So he's going to a military school now that's a more rough and tough environment. And my daughter has had some adjustment issues. She's at a Bible camp now, but she's had some depression. Of course, she's a 13-year-old girl, so they all seem kind of moody. So it's been a hard time. Last year I was sick, had some churches drop me. If you're the winning racehorse, people bet on you, right? But if you're the lame horse, what do they want to do? And some people don't want to support a sick missionary that's just floundering in bed. Mm-hmm.
Is the nature of your sickness the malaria? Or?
Yeah, okay. So when I got medically evacuated with my 24th case of malaria, my liver, my spleen, my gallbladder was swollen. I had high levels of mercury in my blood from the illegal mining, probably. I had a spot in my brain. Then I had 4 other parasites. One was strongyloidiasis, which if it proliferates, it's got about a 90% mortality rate. And so I was pretty messed up. And I would just get tired where I had to lay down wherever I was. So we went to Malaysia, and I had to lay down on the sidewalk because I just could not walk. I basically would collapse, and I could hear the Malaysians say, "Oh, there's a drunk Australian tourist here." I'd be like, "Yes, I'm from Australia. I'm not American." Or I laid down on the hospital floor one time and fell asleep face down on the tile, and how gross is that? And then I had weird issues of loud noises that make me dry heave, and in the age of COVID, if you cough or dry heave, people start looking at you funny, right? And try to go to church, and our church player at my home church would clang on the piano, boom, 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 and it'd send me into dry heaves. So you just look very weird, and people are like, you got a mental problem? I'm like, well, I got a spot in my brain. Does that count? And I just didn't want people to see me like that. And spoke at a church and puked afterwards last year. Another church heard about it and dropped me. Obviously I'm being foolish, trying to go back when I'm not well. You got to come back to America because we're oh so healthy here, right? 70% of the population is overweight, and so many millions are hooked on opioids. Takes me 5 weeks to get a paying appointment, and then they try to give me opioids. So is America really healthier? And so last year was the worst year of my life. And yet God expanded the ministry and gave many blessings, and I could see these faces of these kids, and they'd send me messages, Papa, I graduated, or I'm graduating Bible school, or I got baptized. And so that's it. Jesus is worth it. If I knew that I could go back and only live another year, I think I would do it. I want to go back, and I want to see this work finished. But I feel there is a Korowai church led by Korowai leaders, so I feel, and there seems to be a firm foundation, and so I feel that if the door is closed, I can help from afar and maybe find another dirty, poor area to go to. With a doctorate, I could teach other missionaries. That's a real need, especially among Reformed Baptists. Sometimes we got a head full of theology, but we don't know how to handle the cross-cultural nature of the work. But I'd like to be on the field again. I'd like to be in a poor village again. Mm-hmm.
Trevor, will you give us an email or some way we can contact you so we can encourage you
Fabulous.
while you're here?
Yes. I have every month I send out a prayer letter. I have a Facebook prayer group. I have this video. I'll send all that information to your pastor. And if you want on my prayer letter, just email me and I'll put you on the list. How's that sound? Any final questions? How are we doing on time here? Did I miss anything?
I'm trying to think of as you're talking, I'm thinking. So
Okay. So people ask, I'm part of being a missionary is you get supported by churches. So there's the element of salesmanship, and my wife tells me I'm the worst salesman because I point out all the dirty stuff, the flaws and the failures and the struggles. And then, of course, I don't know what we're going to do next. So, my goal last year was try not to die and maybe finish my dissertation and finish my book. And we want to get back into Asia and keep advising, seeing this grow. Yes?
Yeah, just wondering if you know the language, Indonesian or the local languages.
Yes, I know Indonesian. In Papua, they speak kind of a hillbilly dialect of Indonesian. And then the Korowai language, I was never fluent, but through affirming and practicing, I could write out phonetically what I wanted to say. And the jungle is so hot, if you're writing on paper, the sweat starts from your armpits, how gross. It runs down your arms, runs down your elbows, gets on your paper, the paper totally falls apart. So, we'd eat oatmeal or whatnot, and I'd use the cardboard boxes to write on because they're thicker. And so you see the pictures of Moses coming down Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of stone. So when I'd preach in Korowai, I'd come into the church with 2 big cardboard boxes full of oatmeal, and I'd have the sermon printed on there, and I'd sound it out. Yeah.
How long did it take you to learn
Indonesian?
Yeah.
It's within 6 months you can have basic conversations. Within 2 years, maybe you can do more theological because it's specialized vocabulary. So it's not, as languages go, it's probably an easier language to learn. Mm-hmm.
What was church life like over there? Were you a pastor? Were there many different churches or a few?
Yeah, church life is, we had a wall-less building with poles, a thatched roof, dirt floor, barefoot, wooden benches, or we sat on the ground. We had a pet cassowary, like a flightless bird, looks like an ostrich. They bond with you like a duck or a goose would. So my daughter had one that would follow her into church. You know, it was taller than her, so it would scare her, so she'd start running. We'd see my daughter running back and forth and the bird chasing her. We'd have disputes, people getting up in church to air their grievances against another person. So, you know, wait till you fight till after the church. I'd preach some Sundays. We had a Highland Christian fella that's the Gambala, the shepherd, the pastor. And then we tried to give testimony time to the Korowai believers, and some of them would try to sing in Korowai. And it was just very short and simple and to the point. We found that many shorter services worked better than a long service, because then people begin to get political or air their grievances or whatnot. And often we'd have little Bible studies down at the riverside. We'd cook chicken on the side of the river, help teach people how to swim. You know, Noah's pulled people out of the river before. Noah taught a little girl from the Highlands how to swim, and she saved her parents one time. And we'd have little Bible quizzes. In the afternoon, I'd try to give prizes or games to those that answered right. The local kids loved tug-of-war and games. So we tried to mix it up, and at every opportunity try to plainly explain the gospel. During a medical clinic at 4, people would be treated. We'd gather the kids of the parents down to go over the stories with them in the front yard in between soccer. So yeah, it was a nice life, even though it was hard. I think Rich had a question again.
That's okay, I'll ask.
Okay, it was a no good question, right? Crummy question, so you'll skip. All right.
I was just wondering if you ever had the problem that Paul ran into, where the local tribesmen mistook him for, or thought he was a god because of...
There's some superstition, and there will be people that recognize a difference in spiritual power, like people believe in demons. I had a healthy man say that he was cursed and was going to die. I say there's nothing wrong with you except you're a bit skinny, and he died a week later. And he told me, you know, this can't hurt you because you're different, you know, but these spirits can hurt us. I said, well, you believe in Jesus too, and the Holy Spirit will protect you. But he didn't seem to understand a lot, or a lot of people want Jesus for his benefits, but they don't really care about Jesus, right? That's the same here in the States. So are they attracted to Jesus and the gospel, or are they attracted to the benefits that come with the gospel? Because wherever the gospel goes, there are real material benefits. The stoppage of warfare, the ending of practices like slavery and child brides. You know, people do business more fairly. So life improves if you believe. Oh. Did I answer your question? Okay. Okay. All right, what other questions do you have? Yes?
So you mentioned the man who wrote hymns in the local language and whatnot. What was music like in the tribes before you, well, I mean, you don't know, I suppose, before you came, but just, you know, their normal music culture, and then did that change, or was that incorporated into Christian music?
The tribe is not really advanced. So about the only music they had, a couple of them borrowed drums from the Cheetah tribe downriver, but mostly they had a mouth harp. And their music is chanting. And so it wasn't, they didn't really have a lot of musical instrumentation.
But I mean, like, was it so animistic and fearing of spirits, was music a part of that for them as well?
Only whistling. The witches whistled. And so if you heard any sort of whistling, people would be afraid of the spirits. So one of the new believers thought it was funny to go through the village at night because he was no longer afraid and whistle and laugh. So I'm like, maybe you shouldn't do that. You know, have mercy on these fellas. When they believe, then you can laugh about this, but they're still scared. And you go, okay. So what other questions? Mm-hmm.
You mentioned about church support. Did you go out to Papua under a mission agency or directly into a church?
I started with a mission agency, and there are good and bad mission agencies, but For the Papuan, I work with a large Papuan denomination, the Gidi Church, the Gerejeng Gili di Indonesia, and they are the Evangelical Church of Indonesia, about 1,000 congregations. And they said it is best if your sending church loans you to us and you become a member of us, and then you work directly with us. Because all those groups of missionaries, they just meet together and they don't ask us our opinions. They just decide what they want to do. It's better if you decide with us. And then, you get tired of paying 14.5% of your support to uphold maintain some building. And then you find out they're using your money to make training materials, and the training materials is some gimmicky sort of find a person of peace and plant the church planting movement and do this or that. And I'm like, okay, this is by the numbers, every couple years, especially Southern Baptists and evangelicals, they got some new tactic or new gimmick, some golden key to make missions easier. But missions can't be made easier. 150 years ago, we knew this, and they packed their coffins, they packed their clothes and their belongings in a coffin, fully expecting that half of them would die within the first 5 years, and yet they went out. Mission agencies now are not going to do that. They're risk averse. They're looking for shortcuts, but there really is no shortcut. You suffer and you may die, and it may take many years for the gospel to be planted. And I wonder if we still have that in us in the West. So, sorry to be critical. Okay. Any other questions? I'll wrap this up.
How do you communicate now with the people?
I Facebook the tribal people. Isn't that crazy? Through Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp. And almost daily I have a manager that kind of runs interference and is closer so they can call them in real time, because day here is night there, and night there is day here. So, if I can't sleep at night, about 2 a.m., I end up getting a half a dozen messages from tribal people. My father is sick. I want to go to Bible school. The messages are mostly great because it shows the progress. But it can be when you're sick and you need to tune out. It's hard to do. So, but thankfully we have a team now that often manages things for me. Any final questions? How do I sum this up? Thank you for your time. I'm still alive. I want to go back. Please don't be risk averse. I can puke there just as well as I can puke here.
Just don't puke now.
No, I'll take off the microphone if I do.
Yeah. Trevor, you studied with us a little bit at RBS.
Yes.
When was that? I remember you being a student with us.
I do the missions courses, some of the missions courses.
Yeah.
And I try to keep it practical because we prepare people theologically, but missions is like stress on steroids. When you have tribal people appearing through your screen windows for 12 hours a day, watching you like you're the human zoo, you can't feel like you can't escape.
Right.
Or when you're trying to sleep and they look down through the window at you while you're sleeping, and you wake up and there's a half a dozen eyes on you.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to prepare mission candidates with kind of the gritty, sometimes very uncomfortable details of what happens on the field.
Yeah, remove the romance idea and
Yes.
give them realism.
And then you come back to the States and you have reentry stress and reverse culture shock. And you realize your culture, your home culture, you see the decline of America in 5-year snippets. You're like, what is happening?
Do you have you guys been able to find relationships in Missouri that, are fellowship or close, those kinds of things that you had while you were in Indonesia? Are you finding that here now?
Well, I'd like to, but being so sick last year and having some Christian people counsel me that depression is a sin and stuff, I've kind of put up my walls, and this is very bad, but I've kind of grown cynical and jaded, and my early optimism is no more. So I'm trying to find some, but I can't seem to lower the wall sometimes.
So Trevor has been known to quite a few of us for a number of years. We've followed his ministry out there. He was at Brian's in Minden over the weekend.
Yep.
Yeah, he's going to Kyle Fitzgerald, some of you know him, tomorrow evening. And then, Lord willing, you're heading up to Portland for the weekend. And then are you back to Missouri after that?
Yep.
Is that the plan? So we're continuing to stay in touch and to continue to encourage our brother, as you can imagine. This guy is a real missionary. This is not just a guy that is trying to go around and tell stories. He's really been there. He's really done it. There is real fruit from this brother's ministry, and he's been very honest about the price, the cost that's involved. There's no romance involved in this. This is the real work of the gospel, and it really costs us. And it's a joy for me, brother, to meet you at last.
Thank you.
I've seen many of your pictures, many of your videos over the years, and we certainly want to encourage you, and we're glad that you came tonight. And we're very thankful for that, and we hope that we will continue to build our relationship with you as well.
Thank you.
So have a seat, brother, and have a rest.
Thank you.
Most of you know that Pastor Steve and Kyle and Nathaniel and Brett are at the Radius International Missions Conference in Minneapolis. I'm pretty confident they won't get a session even close to the one we just had at that conference. They'll get good preaching, but they won't get one quite as true to reality of missions as we got from our dear brother tonight. We're thankful that when Pastor Steve comes back, you're going to get a couple of mission sermons on Sunday. The Lord in His providence ordered this week. We can honestly tell you we're so busy that we just trust the Lord, and He just brings things to pass. And this whole week has been a focus for us as a congregation. We know that we're going to have Kyle and Hannah, Lord willing, later in the year going out on the field. And I had the privilege of having dinner tonight with Trevor and with Noah, and we were talking about missions and what the Lord is doing amongst us here. I think it was good for us to hear our brother regarding the realities of when Kyle and Hannah go down the mine, how much we need to be holding these ropes the way that the Lord would have us to hold it. And we want to continue to pray for our brother Trevor as he seeks the Lord regarding what he's able to do right now. He's stuck in the States with the whole COVID issue as well and getting himself stronger again. But isn't it interesting that when the Lord takes His servant off the field, the work of the gospel still goes forward? Because it's not about us. It's about Christ. But He does use real people who are willing to lay down their life for the sake of the gospel. And so as we get together tonight, we're going to close in prayer. I'm going to throw out 2 or 3 prayer points for some of you folks to lead us in prayer specifically. The first, obviously, section, we want to just spend the first half of our time in prayer that we've got left to pray for Trevor. What's your wife's name, Trevor? Teresa, and the family. That the Lord would have His hand upon them and guide and direct them even as they seek Him regarding their future direction, whether it's stateside or Indonesia or Penang or back into Papua or whatever the Lord has right now, that He would make it plain in His providence as to what direction they're to go at this particular time. So Chuck, I'm going to ask you specifically if you would pray just for the Lord to give wisdom and direction and clarity to our brother, to strengthen him and guide him. Remember Noah? I had a good time getting to know Noah a little bit tonight as he's at school here stateside, and of course that in itself throws up all sorts of challenges for families as life changes and children grow up as well. Joe, would you pray specifically for the work in Papua, that the Lord would bless the ministry there, the leaders that are there that are serving the Lord, the churches that are there, the medical missions that are there and that are needy, and that the Lord would continue to build His church in that part of the world as well. And then I'm going to ask Tim if you would pray for Pastor Steve and Kyle and the guys in Minneapolis and for this conference, that as they come back with report of how the Lord has guided they're really trying to build contacts for BTF, Bible Translation Fellowship, just that the Lord would bless that. And then I will close us and I'll pray for the ministry of the Word on the Lord's Day, especially as Pastor Steve comes to preach to us. So Chuck, Joe, and then Tim, okay?